For more than half a century, André Rieu has stood beneath dazzling lights with a violin resting against his shoulder, smiling as thousands of people rise from their seats. Couples dance in the aisles. Families sing along. Elderly fans wipe away tears as melodies they have known for decades fill enormous arenas. To millions around the world, André Rieu represents joy itself. But at 76, there is another side to that story. Not a secret scandal, not a mysterious illness, not some shocking confession hidden from the public. The deeper tragedy surrounding André Rieu is far more human than that. It is the story of a man who has spent nearly his entire life giving happiness to strangers, while time has quietly continued moving forward. And time eventually asked a price from everyone. Born in Maastricht, the Netherlands, in 1949, André Léon-Marie Nicolas Rieu grew up in a world where music was not simply entertainment. It was part of the atmosphere around him. His father was a professional conductor, and André began learning the violin when he was still a young child. From the beginning, the instrument became more than wood and strings. It became a language, and eventually it became his life. Years later, audiences would come to know him as the king of the waltz, the charismatic bandleader who transformed classical music into something colorful, emotional, romantic, and theatrical. Where some classical performances could feel formal and distant, Rieu wanted people to participate. He wanted them to laugh. He wanted them to cry. Most of all, he wanted them to feel alive. That philosophy would eventually change everything. But the road to becoming one of the most recognizable classical crossover performers in the world was not effortless. Behind the elegant costumes, huge stages, chandeliers, flowers, dancers, fireworks, and smiling orchestra members was a demanding operation that required extraordinary discipline. Touring is exhausting even for young musicians. For André Rieu, touring became a way of life. Cities changed. Hotels changed. Audiences changed. But the expectation remained the same. Every night, when André walked onto the stage, people had paid to see the joyful man they believed they knew. They were not there to see exhaustion. They were not there to hear about stress, difficult decisions, financial pressure, logistical problems, or personal fatigue. They wanted magic. And André gave it to them. Again and again. That is what makes his story more complicated than the cheerful image seen in concert recordings. Imagine spending decades knowing that thousands of people are waiting for you to make them happy. Imagine walking onto a stage after countless flights, rehearsals, meetings, technical problems, and sleepless nights, then raising your violin and smiling as though nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. For a performer, that smile becomes part of the job. Eventually, it can become part of the identity. André Rieu built something much larger than a traditional orchestra. His Johann Strauss Orchestra became the heart of an entertainment phenomenon. His concerts grew into elaborate productions capable of turning public squares and arenas into romantic fantasy worlds. That ambition brought enormous success. It also brought enormous responsibility. When hundreds of people depend on a production, every decision matters. Musicians, technicians, drivers, costume teams, administrators, stage crews, and countless others become part of a machine that cannot simply stop whenever its leader feels tired. And André was not merely the face of that machine. He was its center. For decades, he carried that responsibility while maintaining an image built around warmth, optimism, and celebration. Yet no amount of success can negotiate with age. At 76, André Rieu is still associated with the same energy audiences have expected from him for years. The violin still appears. The orchestra still plays. The crowd still arrive hoping to hear the melodies that have become part of weddings, anniversaries, family memories, and final goodbyes. But every performance now carries something it did not carry when he was 30 or 40. A reminder. There are fewer years ahead than behind. For many artists, retirement means stepping away from a profession. For someone like André Rieu, it may mean something far more profound. What happens when the stage has been your home? What happens when applause has followed you across continents? What happens when making other people happy has become one of the central purposes of your existence? That is the shadow behind the waltz. And perhaps that is why André Rieu's story feels unexpectedly emotional. His tragedy is not that the music has disappeared. It is that music cannot stop time. The crowds may continue dancing. The orchestra may continue playing. The lights may continue shining over Maastricht. But eventually, every final note must fade. And for a man who has spent his life making sure the music never stops, that may be the most heartbreaking reality of all. Yet to understand why walking away could ever be so difficult, we have to return to the beginning, to the young boy growing up in Maastricht, holding a violin before he could possibly understand where it would one day take him. Because long before André Rieu became the king of the waltz, music had already chosen him. Long before the enormous crowds, the elaborate stages, and the international tours, André Rieu was simply a boy growing up in Maastricht, surrounded by music so constantly that it became almost impossible to separate it from everyday life. His father, André Rieu Sr., was a professional conductor, and music carried a sense of seriousness inside the family home. This was not the kind of household where classical music was treated as background entertainment. It was work. It was discipline. It was tradition. It demanded attention. For young André, that atmosphere was both a gift and a challenge. He began learning the violin at the age of 5, an age when most children are still discovering what interests them. For André, one of the most important choices of his life had already begun. The violin quickly became central to his identity. But his relationship with classical music would never be simple. Growing up around professional musicians meant that he saw a side of the classical world many audiences never experienced. He saw preparation. He saw repetition. He saw the strict standards that could define an orchestra. He understood that beauty on stage was created through countless hours of work behind the scenes. And he also noticed something else. Classical music could sometimes feel distant, formal, almost intimidating. Concert halls traditionally came with rules: how to dress, when to clap, when to remain silent, how to behave. For some listeners, this created an atmosphere of prestige. For others, it created a barrier. André would eventually spend much of his career trying to tear that barrier down. But as a child, he was still learning what music meant to him personally. His father's career exposed him to orchestras and conductors, but André did not simply want to imitate the serious world around him. Somewhere inside him was a different instinct. He wanted music to connect directly with people. He wanted people to smile. He wanted couples to dance. He wanted audiences to experience classical melodies without feeling they had entered a museum. That idea would take years to fully form, but the seeds were already there. As André continued his musical education, he studied violin seriously and eventually attended conservatories in Liège and Maastricht. He later continued at the Royal Conservatory in Brussels, developing the technical foundation expected of a professional classical musician. This was not the path of someone who accidentally stumbled into fame. It required years of training. And training at that level can be unforgiving. A musician does not become strong enough for professional performance simply by loving music. Love alone cannot perfect intonation. It cannot build technique. It cannot replace repetition. Hours disappear into practice rooms. The same passage is repeated again and again. Mistakes that audiences might never notice become unacceptable to the musician making them. And over time, the instrument can begin to feel less like a hobby and more like an extension of the body. For André, however, technique was never going to be the final destination. He began to understand that what moved him most was not perfection for its own sake. It was emotion. One piece in particular would become deeply associated with the direction of his life: the waltz. The waltz possessed something that many forms of classical music did not immediately offer to ordinary listeners. movement, romance, memory. People did not simply listen to a waltz. They could imagine themselves inside it. The music suggested grand ballrooms, elegant dresses, spinning couples, first loves, lost loves, and a Europe that seemed to exist somewhere between history and fantasy. André recognized the emotional power of that world. He was fascinated by Johann Strauss too, and the Viennese waltz tradition, but he did not want to preserve it behind glass. He wanted to make it live again. That ambition placed him on a path that would eventually separate him from many conventions of the classical establishment. In the early stages of his professional life, however, there was no guarantee that this vision would work. A young musician trying to build a career faces uncertainty that fame often hides in retrospect. There are no giant audiences yet. No international television specials. No sold-out squares in Maastricht. There is only the question every aspiring performer eventually confronts. Can I actually build a life from this? André played professionally and gained experience, but he increasingly felt drawn towards something more personal. He wanted his own musical identity. He wanted an ensemble that reflected his philosophy rather than someone else's. In 1978, he helped create the Maastricht Salon Orchestra. Years later, he would establish the Johann Strauss Orchestra, the ensemble that would eventually become inseparable from his name. At first, it was modest. There was no reason to assume it would become a worldwide phenomenon. But André had something extremely powerful. A clear vision. He believed classical music did not need to be cold to be respected. It did not need to be inaccessible to be beautiful. And perhaps most importantly, audiences did not need to understand musical theory in order to be emotionally overwhelmed by a melody. That belief would eventually make him famous. It would also expose him to criticism. Some classical purists would question the spectacle, the theatricality, and the popular presentation of music traditionally associated with concert halls. But André was not trying to satisfy everyone. He was trying to create a feeling. That distinction would define his entire career. And slowly, the boy who had grown up beneath the shadow of a conductor father began stepping into his own spotlight. He was no longer simply performing classical music. He was beginning to reinvent the way millions of ordinary people would experience it. And once André Rieu discovered that formula, there would be no easy way back. Because the next step was not simply to build an orchestra. It was to build a world. By the time André Rieu began shaping the musical identity that would define his career, he had already understood something that many performers spend decades trying to discover. Technical skill alone was not enough. A perfect performance could impress an audience. But André wanted something more. He wanted to move them. He wanted people who had never bought a classical record, never studied a score, and never attended a formal concert to feel that the music belonged to them too. That idea sounds simple now. At the time, it was far more radical. Classical music had long carried an image of seriousness. There were traditions, expectations, and unwritten rules about how musicians should behave and how audiences should respond. Concert halls could be magnificent places, but for some people, they also felt intimidating. André saw an opportunity. What if the walls could come down? What if classical music could feel like a celebration instead of an examination? What if audiences were encouraged to sing, laugh, dance, and even cry without worrying about whether they were behaving correctly? That question would become the foundation of everything he built. When the Johann Strauss Orchestra began taking shape, André was not interested in creating another conventional ensemble. He wanted personality. He wanted warmth. He wanted musicians who could connect visually and emotionally with the people in front of them. The result was something unmistakable. The women wore elegant, colorful dresses. The men performed in formal attire. The stage often looked more like a romantic ballroom than a traditional concert platform. There were flowers, chandeliers, theatrical entrances, dancers, guest singers, and carefully staged moments designed to make an audience feel as though they had stepped into another world. For critics, it could seem excessive. For fans, it was unforgettable. André understood something crucial about entertainment. People rarely remember technical perfection alone. They remember how an experience made them feel. A couple who danced together during the Blue Danube might remember that night for the rest of their lives. A grandmother hearing a melody from her youth might suddenly be transported back 50 years. A widower in the audience might hear a song once shared with his wife and find himself crying before he even understands why. That emotional reaction was the real product. The orchestra was simply the vehicle, and André became a master at delivering it. But success did not come without resistance. Some members of the traditional classical world viewed his approach with skepticism. To them, the spectacle risked turning serious music into entertainment designed for mass consumption. André did not seem particularly troubled by that criticism. He had never claimed that every performance needed to satisfy the strictest interpretation of classical tradition. His mission was different. He wanted access. He wanted emotion. He wanted the waltz to breathe again. And audiences responded in enormous numbers. As his popularity grew, concerts expanded in scale. What had begun as a relatively modest artistic vision evolved into a touring phenomenon. The world of André Rieu became instantly recognizable. He was no longer just a violinist. He was a brand, a band leader, a producer, a businessman, and, increasingly, the central figure responsible for keeping an enormous operation alive. That transition brought new pressure. When an artist becomes successful, the outside world often assumes life becomes easier. In reality, success can create a different kind of burden. More people depend on you. More money is at risk. More expectations must be met. A canceled show is no longer simply an artistic disappointment. It can affect hundreds of workers, thousands of ticket holders, transportation schedules, venues, hotels, equipment shipments, and contracts across multiple countries. André's dream was becoming bigger than him. That was both the triumph and the danger. The more elaborate the concerts became, the more difficult it became to maintain the illusion of effortless joy. Behind every magical evening was a machine working with extraordinary precision. Stages had to be built. Costumes had to arrive. Musicians had to travel. Instruments had to be protected. Lighting, sound, rehearsals, transportation, and accommodation all had to function correctly. And at the center stood André, smiling with his violin. That smile mattered. Audiences did not come to see the pressure. They came to escape their own. And perhaps that was one of the most demanding parts of the life he had chosen. A performer can be tired and still perform. He can be worried and still smile. He can be carrying responsibilities no audience will ever understand and still walk onto a stage, as though the only thing that matters is the next beautiful melody. That is the bargain. André had built his career on happiness. So happiness had to be delivered. Night after night. Country after country. Year after year. The formula worked so well that it became impossible to imagine André Rieu without it. The violin. The orchestra. The costumes. The waltzes. The smiling faces. But behind that fantasy world was an increasingly serious reality. The bigger André dreamed, the more expensive those dreams became. And eventually, his ambition would lead him toward decisions that carried risks far greater than most of his fans ever realized. Because creating a musical empire is one thing. Keeping it alive is something else entirely. And André Rieu was about to learn just how dangerous success could become. As André Rieu's popularity exploded, the dream became larger. And so did the risk. What had once been a relatively simple musical idea, bring the waltz back to ordinary people, was gradually transformed into one of the most ambitious touring productions in classical crossover entertainment. The concerts became bigger. The stages became more elaborate. The number of people involved increased. And behind the romantic image of André standing beneath chandeliers with a violin in his hands, the financial reality became increasingly serious. Success had created an empire. But empires are expensive. André was not content to stand in front of an orchestra and simply perform a selection of familiar pieces. He wanted spectacle. He wanted audiences to feel that they had stepped into another world. That meant costumes, lighting, scenery, dancers, singers, technical crews, transportation, rehearsals, hotels, and an enormous amount of planning. Every detail cost money. And the greater the ambition, the greater the exposure. For many artists, the safest decision would have been to reduce the scale. André repeatedly chose the opposite. He believed that if the audience was going to buy a ticket, they deserved an experience they could never forget. So he kept pushing. Bigger stages. More elaborate productions. More dramatic entrances. More musicians. More cities. More countries. And eventually, some of his ideas became so ambitious that even people around him reportedly questioned whether they were practical. One of the most famous examples came when André became fascinated with the idea of recreating a massive version of Vienna's Schönbrunn Palace as part of his concert production. It was not a small decorative backdrop. The concept was enormous. A grand palace-like set designed to create the illusion of a royal European setting, complete with the visual extravagance audiences had come to associate with André Rieu. Artistically, it was extraordinary. Financially, it was dangerous. Transporting a huge production from location to location requires an entirely different level of logistics than traveling with a conventional orchestra. Trucks must move equipment. Workers must assemble and dismantle the set. Venues must accommodate the structure. Every additional component creates another potential problem. And every problem has a price. For André, however, the artistic vision came first. That determination had helped make him successful. Now it was beginning to test the limits of what his organization could sustain. At one stage in his career, the costs associated with his ambitious productions placed enormous financial pressure on his company. The man audiences saw smiling beneath the stage lights was operating inside a business where enormous sums of money could be gained or lost, depending on whether the next tour succeeded. That is a side of celebrity that fans rarely see. From the audience, success looks permanent. A sold-out arena creates the impression that everything must be profitable. Thousands of people are buying tickets. Merchandise is being sold. Television specials attract viewers. Albums move around the world. Surely the person at the center must feel completely secure. But large entertainment productions can consume money at astonishing speed. A single ambitious decision can create expenses that continue long after the applause ends. And André was not gambling only with his own comfort. He was responsible for an organization. Musicians depended on the orchestra. Crew members depended on the tours. Families depended on those salaries. Suddenly, the romantic dream carried a very practical burden. If André failed, others could feel the consequences. That responsibility could have forced him to retreat. Instead, he kept going. There is something almost contradictory about André Rieu's public image during this period. On stage, he represented certainty. He walked confidently among his musicians. He joked with audiences. He lifted his bow. The music began. Everything appeared effortless. Off stage, however, the world he had created required constant decision-making. A touring production does not sleep simply because its star is tired. Problems arise at airports. Equipment is delayed. Venues change. People become ill. Weather interferes. Currencies fluctuate. Ticket sales vary from city to city. And every night, the audience still expects perfection. The pressure must have been extraordinary. But André had built his career around one central belief. Emotion was worth the effort. He had watched audiences dance. He had seen strangers embrace. He had watched elderly couples hold each other as the orchestra played music that reminded them of another time. Those moments reinforced his conviction that the spectacle mattered. To him, the large production was not meaningless extravagance. It was part of the experience, and as long as people continued to respond, he seemed willing to carry the weight. Yet success of that magnitude creates another problem. You become trapped by your own standard. Once audiences have seen the chandeliers, the costumes, the enormous stages, and the theatrical grandeur, a simple concert can feel like a retreat. The dream must keep growing, or at least it must never appear to shrink. That creates a dangerous cycle. Expectation becomes pressure. Pressure becomes expense. Expense creates risk. And risk demands even greater success. For years, André kept the cycle moving. The concerts remained spectacular. The crowds kept coming. The Johann Strauss Orchestra became internationally recognizable. But underneath the celebration was a question that few fans ever asked. How long could one man continue carrying something this large? Because André Rieu was no longer simply playing the violin. He was carrying the livelihoods of an entire organization, the expectations of millions of fans, and the financial weight of a dream that had grown far beyond anything he could have imagined as a young musician in Maastricht. And then came the moments every touring artist fears. The moments when planning is no longer enough. When the music has to stop. When health, circumstance, or forces completely outside your control suddenly remind you that even the most carefully built empire can be fragile. For André Rieu, those interruptions would reveal something the glittering concerts could never hide. No matter how powerful the music feels, the people creating it are still human. For years, André Rieu had built his world around one reassuring idea. When the lights came on, the music would begin. No matter how complicated the preparations had been, audiences rarely saw the problems behind the curtain. They saw elegance, laughter, beautiful costumes, sweeping waltzes, and a conductor who seemed completely at home in the middle of it all. But touring has a way of reminding even the most successful performers that control is an illusion. Sometimes the music simply has to stop. One of the most painful examples came during André Rieu's UK arena tour in December 2016. The remaining concerts were postponed after a longtime member of the Johann Strauss Orchestra suffered a severe heart attack. Reports at the time emphasized that it was an orchestra member, not André himself, who became critically ill. For a production accustomed to moving from city to city with extraordinary precision, everything suddenly changed. There were tickets, venues, travel plans, hotels, thousands of people waiting. None of it mattered anymore. A human life had become more important than the schedule. For audiences, an orchestra can appear almost like one beautiful collective organism. Musicians take their places, the conductor raises his hands, and the entire group seems to breathe together. But behind that image are individual people. Friends. Partners. Parents. Colleagues who may have spent decades traveling beside one another. The musician affected in 2016 had reportedly been with the orchestra for more than 20 years. That kind of relationship goes far beyond simply sharing a stage. It means countless rehearsals, long journeys, backstage conversations, celebrations, frustrations, and memories accumulated over years. Suddenly, the cheerful world André had built was confronted by something no amount of preparation could soften. Mortality. And that is where the story of André Rieu becomes more emotional than the spectacle might suggest. When viewers watch one of his concerts, they often see musicians smiling at each other. André moves around the stage, jokes with the audience, and creates the impression of a giant musical family. Moments like the 2016 crisis show that this sense of family is not merely decorative. When one person falls, the entire production feels it. Years later, an even larger interruption arrived. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic brought the international live entertainment industry to a halt. André Rieu's touring plans were disrupted along with those of performers around the world. Concerts were postponed, then postponed again. His official organization announced that scheduled UK and Ireland dates originally affected in 2020 had to be moved again into 2022 because of the continuing pandemic. His US tour faced similar delays. For an artist whose entire professional identity depended on bringing large groups of people together, the situation was cruelly ironic. André's concerts had always celebrated human closeness. People held hands. They danced beside strangers. Thousands sang together. Elderly couples embraced as familiar melodies filled the room. Then suddenly, closeness itself became dangerous. Concert halls went quiet. Stages remained empty. Tour buses stopped moving. The Johann Strauss Orchestra, a machine built around movement, gathering, and celebration, could no longer operate normally. For many performers, losing concerts meant losing income. For André, the stakes extended far beyond one individual performer. He had spent decades building an organization filled with musicians and employees who depended on the continuation of the business. This was no ordinary canceled evening. It was an existential interruption for the entire live performance industry. And perhaps for André, it also forced an uncomfortable question. What happens when the applause disappears? An artist can become so accustomed to the rhythm of touring that silence itself feels unnatural. You wake up knowing where the next performance will be. You travel. You rehearse. You walk onto the stage. You hear the reaction. Then you repeat it somewhere else. For decades, that rhythm had defined André Rieu's life. Suddenly, there was no next audience waiting behind the curtain. No sea of people standing as the orchestra entered. No couples beginning to dance when the first familiar notes appeared. Only uncertainty. For someone approaching the later chapters of life, lost time can feel especially precious. A young performer may assume there will always be another tour, another summer, another concert, another opportunity. But age changes the mathematics. Every postponed year matters more. And yet the extraordinary thing about André Rieu's story is that the silence did not become the ending. The orchestra returned. The tours resumed. The crowds came back. And even in 2026, official schedules continued to list performances across Europe and beyond, demonstrating that the musical machine had survived one of the greatest disruptions of André's career. But something had changed. Not necessarily in the way audiences could see. The chandeliers could still shine. The dresses could still sparkle. The waltzes could still make people dance. Yet the interruptions had revealed how fragile it all was. A heartbeat could stop a tour. A global crisis could silence an orchestra. And someday, age itself would eventually ask André Rieu to confront a final interruption that no rescheduling could solve. At 76, that question is no longer abstract. How many more times can he walk onto the stage? How many more summers in Maastricht? How many more nights beneath the lights? Nobody can know. And perhaps that uncertainty is exactly what makes every remaining performance feel more precious. Because after spending a lifetime proving that the music can survive almost anything, André Rieu now faces the one opponent no musician has ever defeated. At 76, André Rieu is still doing something many people much younger would find exhausting. He travels. He rehearses. He performs. He carries the expectations of audiences who have followed him for decades. And every time he walks onto a stage, there is a strange contradiction in what the crowd sees. They see the same André Rieu they remember. The violin. The smile. The gestures. The humor. The confidence. But time does not stand still simply because an audience wants it to. That may be the most difficult reality for any performer whose identity has been built around physical presence. Music can be recorded. Concerts can be filmed. Memories can be preserved. But the act of performing live requires a body. And bodies change. Reflexes change. Energy changes. Recovery takes longer. Travel becomes harder. The schedule that once felt demanding can eventually become punishing. André has never needed to turn those realities into a public tragedy in order for them to matter. The simple truth of aging is dramatic enough. For decades, fans have watched him seemingly suspend time. A familiar waltz begins, and suddenly an elderly couple may feel young again. A melody from childhood can erase half a century in a matter of seconds. A song connected to someone who is gone can make that person feel present again. That is one of music's greatest illusions. It can make time feel reversible. But André himself cannot reverse it. He can play the Blue Danube again. He can return to Maastricht. He can recreate the atmosphere of another era. But he cannot become 40 again. And that difference gives his later performances a weight they never had before. There is also another emotional dimension. For younger audiences, André Rieu may simply be a famous violinist. For longtime fans, he represents something more personal. Some discovered his music during marriages. Others watched his concerts with parents who are no longer alive. Some may have traveled to Maastricht for anniversaries. Others may associate his songs with funerals, reunions, birthdays, or family traditions. So when André grows older, part of his audience grows older with him. That relationship changes the meaning of the concert. It is no longer only entertainment. It becomes continuity. A reminder that something familiar has survived. That the music is still there. That André is still there. And this may explain why the possibility of retirement carries so much emotional power. For many people, retirement is supposed to be a reward. Work ends. Schedules disappear. There is finally time to rest. But performing artists often face a very different psychological challenge. What exactly are you retiring from if your profession has become your identity? André Rieu is not merely someone who plays violin for a living. His public life has been built around creating a very specific world. His name is connected to the Johann Strauss Orchestra. His face is connected to Maastricht. His personality is woven into the performance itself. Remove him from the stage, and the question is not simply who plays the next concert. The question is what remains of the world he created. That must be an extraordinary thing to contemplate. An orchestra can continue. Musicians can perform the same repertoire. Another conductor can raise a baton. But the chemistry would inevitably be different. The laughter would be different. The pacing would be different. The connection between stage and audience would be different. Because for decades, André has not just led the concert. He has been the emotional narrator of it. He tells the audience when to relax, when to laugh, when to sing, when to dance. He transforms formal performance into something closer to a communal celebration. That is difficult to replace, perhaps impossible. And this creates a strange burden for a performer in the later stage of life. The more beloved you become, the harder it may be to leave. People want one more concert, one more tour, One more summer. One more waltz. There is always someone who has never seen you live. Someone who saved money for years. Someone bringing a parent for the first time. Someone who believes this may be their last opportunity. How do you say no to that? But eventually every artist must. And that is the quiet tension now surrounding André Rieu. Not scandal. Not catastrophe. Not a hidden secret waiting to be exposed. A much simpler and more painful question. When is enough enough? There is dignity in continuing. There is also dignity in knowing when to stop. The problem is that nobody else can decide where that line exists. Not the fans. Not the critics. Not the people who work for the organization. Only André. And perhaps that decision becomes harder because the stage gives something back to him as well. Watch the way he responds to an audience. The relationship does not appear one-directional. He gives them music. They give him energy. He gives them nostalgia. They give him applause. He makes them feel young. And in some strange way, thousands of people standing to cheer may allow him to feel untouched by age for another evening. Then the lights go down. The audience leaves. The stage becomes empty again. And the calendar continues moving. At 76, every tour inevitably exists closer to the last tour than the first. Every performance becomes part of a shrinking number, even though nobody knows what that number is. That is why André Rieu's story does not need an invented tragedy to feel heartbreaking. The real tragedy is already present in the beauty of what he has created. Nothing this extraordinary can continue forever. The orchestra will eventually play without him. Maastricht will eventually have a summer when he does not walk into the square carrying his violin. And millions of people who once believed the music would always return will have to accept that even the happiest traditions eventually become memories. But before that day arrives, André Rieu is still doing what he has always done. Walking beneath the lights. Raising the violin. Looking out at the crowd. And asking the music to defeat time for just one more night. There is a temptation, when telling the story of someone as famous as André Rieu, to search for a hidden tragedy. A secret illness. A family rupture. A scandal. A devastating confession that supposedly explains everything. But the truth does not need to be exaggerated to be emotional. At 76, André Rieu's most heartbreaking story may be the simplest one of all. He built something beautiful that cannot last forever. For decades, audiences have watched him turn concert halls and public squares into places where ordinary people were allowed to forget the world outside. For a few hours, bills did not matter. Bad news did not matter. Age did not matter. Loss did not matter. The orchestra began to play, couples stood up, and suddenly the room belonged to another time. That was André Rieu's gift. He created escape. But even the man who created that escape cannot escape time himself. That is the irony at the heart of his life. He became famous for music that makes people feel young. Waltzes can make an elderly couple remember the first time they danced together. A familiar melody can return someone to childhood. A violin can reopen memories thought to be buried forever. Music does that. It bends time emotionally, but only emotionally. The clock continues. The years continue. André himself continues growing older, even while the music around him appears unchanged. Perhaps this is why watching him perform later in life can feel different from watching recordings made decades earlier. The joy is still there, but so is awareness. Every standing ovation now carries another meaning. Every return to Maastricht becomes another chapter that cannot be repeated indefinitely. Every bow at the end of a concert contains a question nobody wants to ask. How many more? There is no reason to turn that question into a prediction. No one knows when André will decide to slow down or stop. And that decision belongs to him. But what makes the thought powerful is how deeply his identity has become connected with the stage. Some performers can separate their profession from their private selves. They finish work and return home. For André, that boundary has always seemed more complicated. He did not merely join an orchestra. He built one. He did not merely perform concerts. He constructed an entire emotional universe around them. His name became inseparable from the Johann Strauss Orchestra, from the extravagant productions, from the sound of waltzes filling enormous spaces. That kind of achievement comes with a hidden cost. When your work becomes your identity, stepping away can feel like losing a part of yourself. And there is another layer that makes his story even more poignant. The audience itself is aging. Fans who discovered André decades ago have lived entire chapters of their lives beside his music. Children became adults. Adults became grandparents. Couples celebrated anniversaries. Families changed. Some people who once attended his concerts together are no longer here. Yet the recordings remain. The melodies remain. And André remains, still walking onto the stage and performing music connected to memories that may now belong to another lifetime. In that sense, his concerts are not simply performances anymore. They are reunions with the past. That is why the emotion can be so intense. A person may come to hear a waltz and suddenly remember a mother, a father, a husband, a wife, a home that no longer exists. Music has an extraordinary ability to bring back people and places for a few minutes. And André has spent much of his career acting as the guide into those memories. But eventually, he too will become part of them. That may be the most difficult truth of all. Someday, audiences will watch recordings of André Rieu the same way they now watch legendary performers from earlier generations. They will notice the smile, the violin, the way he turned toward the orchestra, the way thousands of people rose to their feet. They may say, "I saw him once," or "My parents loved him," or "We played this song at our wedding." And suddenly André Rieu will no longer belong to the present. He will belong to memory. But that day is not today. That matters. Because the real lesson of André Rieu's story is not about mourning someone who is still here. It is about understanding the value of something while it still exists. The concerts are meaningful precisely because they cannot continue forever. The applause matters because silence eventually comes. The music feels precious because every performance is temporary. And perhaps André understood that long before many of us did. A waltz itself teaches the same lesson. It begins. It rises. It carries you around the room. And then, whether you want it to or not, the final note arrives. You cannot hold it. You cannot demand another minute from the melody. You can only remember how it made you feel. André Rieu has spent his life creating those feelings for millions of people. That is his legacy. Not tragedy in the sensational sense. Not some dark secret hidden behind the smile. Something far more universal. The heartbreaking knowledge that even the most joyful chapters eventually end. For now, however, the violin is still in his hands. The orchestra is still waiting. The audience is still watching. And somewhere another couple is standing up to dance. Perhaps that is the most beautiful way to understand André Rieu at 76. Not as a man defeated by time, but as a man who has spent his entire life challenging it. One waltz at a time,